Tonight, a warm story from a great inn on an old desert road, long ago, about a young traveller far from home, a cold night under hard, bright stars, and the one fire that made a family of strangers. The desert went cold as the sun went down, the way it always did, and Aram, alone on the long road, was glad to see the walls of the great inn rise up at last out of the dusk ahead. He had been walking since before noon, leading his one camel by its rope, and he was young and a long way from home, and tired in the particular way of someone who has been among strangers and strange country for many days, with many more still to go. The road he walked was an old one, older than anyone, a thread of beaten track across the wide pale sand that traders had followed for hundreds of years, carrying their goods from one far city to another. And every so far along it, about a day's journey apart, there stood one of the great inns, a high square fort of stone and mud brick, with thick walls and one wide gate, built long ago for no other reason than to take travellers in for the night, to give them and their beasts a safe wall against the cold and the dark, a well of water, and a place to rest before the next long day. Aram had stopped at one every night of his journey. He was always glad to see them, but he had not yet felt at home in one, for he travelled alone, and the inns were full of strangers. This one rose ahead of him now, dark against the last red of the sky, its walls warm-coloured in the dying light, a thread of smoke going up from within. As he came near, the great gate stood open, and the sounds of it came out to meet him, beasts and voices in languages he did not know, and somewhere a small bell, and under it all the deep murmur of many tired people settling in for the night. Aram led his camel in through the gate, into the great open courtyard within, and stood a moment at the edge of it all, a stranger, not quite knowing where he fit. It was a feeling he had grown used to these last weeks on the road. So he found a clear bit of wall and led his tired camel over to it and began, quietly, to see to it for the night. The courtyard was a small world of its own, walled all around against the night. In the middle of it was the well, and all around the edges, under the arches of the walls, the travellers were making their camps, each little group to itself, their beasts couched and unloaded, their bundles set down. There were more people than Aram had expected, and they had come, he could see, from everywhere. There was a long camel train of traders, with bolts of cloth and boxes of who knew what, their drivers calling to the beasts in a speech all of its own. There was a family travelling together, a woman and her children, and an old grandmother, settling into a corner with the ease of people who had done this many nights. There were two merchants in fine dusty robes, and a lone holy man with nothing but a staff and a bowl, and a man with a cage of small bright birds, and others, people who, Aram thought, looking round, had between them more languages than he had ever heard, and faces from lands he could not even name. They watered their camels at the one well, taking turns, easy about it, nodding to one another, strangers all, and went on with their settling. Aram watered his own camel when his turn came, and led it back to his bit of wall, and folded its legs under it for the night, and gave it the last of his fodder, and rubbed the road dust off its long, patient nose. The camel groaned and chewed, and was content. That much, at least, he knew how to do. That much was the same in every language. But when the camel was seen to, and there was nothing left to busy himself with, Aram sat down against the cold wall with his blanket round his shoulders, alone at the edge of all that murmuring strangeness, and did not quite know what to do with himself. The way you don't, when everyone around you belongs to someone, and you belong, just now, to no one. Above the open courtyard, the first hard, bright stars were coming out in the darkening sky. Then, as the dark came down full, and the cold came with it, they lit the fire. Not the little cooking fires of the separate camps, those were lit too, but the great fire in the middle of the courtyard by the well. A big open fire of brushwood and dried dung and a little precious wood, built up by the keeper of the inn and whoever helped him, until it caught and climbed and threw its light and its heat out across the whole courtyard. And at the lighting of it, something in the place changed. For the cold of the desert night is a real cold, a deep and serious cold. And there is only one truly warm place in all that dark, and it is the fire. And so, one by one, from all their separate corners, the travellers got up and drifted toward it. The traders came, and the family, and the merchants, and the holy man, and the bird seller, drawn out of their own small camps by the one big warmth, and they settled themselves down around the great fire in a wide ring. All of them, the whole strange mixed company of the road, their faces turning gold in its light. Aram watched them gather from his place by the cold wall. He was cold too. The fire was warm and bright, and he wanted to go to it. But they were all strangers, in their close circle, speaking their many languages, and he hung back, the way you do, not sure he was wanted, not sure there was a place for him. He sat against his wall a moment longer, alone in the cold, looking at the warm ring of them. And then an old man at the edge of the firelight turned and saw him sitting there in the dark, and lifted a hand and waved him in. Aram got up and came to the fire. He came shyly to the edge of the ring, but the old man, a camel driver by the look of him, old and brown and creased as the road itself, only shifted along to make a space and patted the ground beside him. And so Aram sat down in the ring of them, in the warmth, at last. No one made a fuss of him. No one asked him who he was, or where he was from, or where he was bound. And even if they had, he could not have answered, for the old camel driver had not one word of Aram's language, nor Aram of his. But it did not seem to matter. The old man reached behind him and brought out a small battered pot and set it in the embers at the fire's edge. And after a while, it began to steam, and the smell of it came out, mint and something sweet. And when it was ready, he poured a little glass of hot mint tea and held it out, without a word, to Aram. And that was all it took. Aram took the glass in both cold hands. It was almost too hot to hold, and he held it anyway, for the warmth of it, and drank. And the hot, sweet mint tea went down into him and warmed him from the middle out. He looked up to thank the old man and found he did not need words for it. He only nodded and put his hand to his heart. And the old man's creased face creased further into a smile. And he nodded back. And that was the whole of it. And it was enough. Someone else passed him a torn piece of flat bread. Someone moved over a little to give him more of the fire. And just like that, without a single word, he understood. Aram was no longer at the edge of it, looking in. He was in it. The fire cracked and threw up sparks toward the stars. The tea went round, and the cold, dark desert drew back from the warm ring of them and waited outside the walls. And so the night went on, around the fire, the way those nights do. The tea went round, and then it went round again. The bread was shared out, and dates, and someone's dried fruit, and a little of this, and a little of that from everyone's stores, until it was a sort of supper that belonged to no one, and to everyone. And the talk went round too. Talk in a dozen languages, and no one understood the half of it. And that did not stop it at all. People spoke and laughed, and the others laughed with them, at the warmth of it, if not the sense of it. A man told a long story in a language only he and his sons could follow, and acted out the good parts with his hands, and the whole ring of strangers watched his hands and laughed in all the right places. And someone began, softly, to play, a small stringed thing, a few simple notes going round and round, and a woman sang low over it, in words no one else there knew. And it did not matter in the least that they did not know the words, because everyone, everywhere, knows what it is to be sung to beside a fire. And a small thing happened, near the end, that Aram would remember the longest. One of the family's children, a little girl, shy as he was, who had been watching him sidelong across the fire, got up and came round to him, and held out, on her flat, open palm, a single sweet date from her own small share, and looked up at him, and waited. Aram took it, and ate it, and made his eyes go wide at how good it was. And the little girl laughed, a bright, surprised laugh, and ran back to her grandmother. And Aram, who had come into this place with nothing to give and no one to give it to, found that even he, the stranger at the edge, had been let to take and give a small kindness across the fire. He was not only let in now, he was one of them, and could pass the warmth along. Aram sat among them, warm now and fed now. His glass filled again whenever it emptied, and he looked round at the faces in the firelight. All those strangers from all those lands, brought together by nothing but the same road and the same cold and the same need of a little warmth. And he saw that they had become, in the space of one evening, something very like a family. Not a real one. They would scatter in the morning, everyone to a different road, and most would never meet again. But tonight, around this fire, under these stars, they were a family, and he was in it. And the aloneness he had carried for weeks on the road had quietly, somewhere in the passing of the tea, set itself down. He had no words for any of them. He did not need them. He sat in the warm ring and was one of them, and that was enough. Slowly, as the night deepened, the fire burned down. The stories grew fewer. The music stopped. One by one, the travellers wrapped themselves in their blankets and lay down where they were, around the dying fire, and back in their own corners under the arches. The long day and the warm tea and the late hour, pulling them all down towards sleep at the same gentle pace. The camels were dark, resting shape around the walls. The keeper banked the great fire down to a deep red glow that would last the night and keep the worst of the cold off them all. Aram lay down too, among the others, near the warm red embers, with his blanket round him and his head on his bundle. Above the open courtyard, the stars were out in their thousands now, hard and bright and uncountable in the deep black sky, wheeling their slow way over the desert, as they had over every traveller who had ever lain down in this courtyard, hundreds of years of them, all the way back. It was a vast and ancient dark up there. But down here, within the walls, around the warm red coals, there was the small, close family of the night, the breathing of the sleepers, the shift of a camel, the last soft tick of the fire, and Aram, lying among them, warm and full, and no longer in the least alone, found that the great road and the great dark held no fear for him at all tonight. He would rise in the morning, and so would they, and they would water the camels and load the beasts and go their dozen separate ways, and the courtyard would empty, and the long road would have them all again. But that was the morning. Tonight there was the fire, and the family it had made, and the stars, and sleep. The great fire banked low and red in the middle of the dark courtyard. The travellers all asleep around it, the camels resting dark against the walls, the 1,000 hard bright stars wheeling slow over the high open square, and the young traveller, a stranger at dusk, and one of the family by night, asleep at last among them, warm and held, and in no hurry at all for the morning and the road. Tonight, a quiet story from the end of summer, high in the mountains long ago, about an old shepherd, his good dogs, and the long, slow walk home, bringing the whole flock down to the warm valley before the winter came. At the very end of the summer, on the morning they would go down, old Anders stood at the door of his hut on the high pasture and felt the first real cold of the year come off the peaks. All summer he had been up here, high on the mountain, where the grass grew sweet and short, and the air was thin and clear. Up here, with his flock and his dogs, in the little stone hut, the way shepherds had spent the high summers on this mountain, for longer than anyone could say. It had been a good summer, warm and long, the sheep grown fat on the mountain grass, the lambs of the spring grown strong and sturdy over the months of it. But summer on a mountain does not last. The mornings had been getting colder for weeks now, and this morning, looking up, Anders saw what he had been waiting to see. The first snow of the year, fallen in the night, dusting white the high peaks above the pasture. That was the sign. That was always the sign. The snow on the tops meant the summer was over and the winter was coming, and that it was time, today, to take the flock down off the high mountain, down the long path, all the way down to the home valley far below, where the snow did not lie deep and the sheep could winter warm and safe. Up here, in another few weeks, the snow would come down off the peaks and cover the pasture and close the high pass, and no flock could live in it. Down there, the valley was still green. So today, they would go down, the way Anders had taken them down at the end of every summer of his long life. There was no hurry about it. The snow was only on the very tops. The deep snows that close a mountain were weeks off yet, and Anders knew the mountain and its weather the way he knew his own two hands. And he had set out for home, as he always did, in good and easy time. But it was a long way down, a whole day's slow walking, down off the heights and through the high rocks and the pass, and down the long green slopes to the valley. And a flock walks slowly, and so they would start in the morning and be home by the evening, with the whole gentle day to do it in. He whistled the dogs to him, and they came. And he looked out once more over the high summer pasture, gold in the early sun. And then he turned to bring his flock down home. First, the dogs gathered the flock. The sheep were scattered wide over the high pasture, grazing the last of the morning, the way they always were, and gathering them was the dogs' work, and the dogs lived for it. They were young, Anders's two dogs, quick and keen and clever, in the prime of their working lives. He had raised them and trained them himself, and they knew his every whistle. They flew out now, low and fast across the pasture, one wide to the left and one wide to the right, sweeping round behind the scattered sheep and bringing them in, easing them, not frightening them, the way a good dog does, gathering the whole wide flock gently in toward the head of the path. Anders stood and watched them work, and was, as he always was, quietly proud of them. He was old now, and slow on the steep ground, and could not run the mountain the way he once had. But he did not need to, because the dogs could, and he had taught them to, and that was simply how it went. The legs grew old, and you trained up young legs to do the running, and the work went on. At his heel stood old Bran, his own first dog, grey about the face now, and long retired from the running, who came along on these journeys only to be near his master, and who watched the young ones work with the calm and knowing eye of an old hand who had done it all himself, once, and done it well. When the flock was gathered, all of them, the ewes and the grown lambs bunched and ready at the head of the path, the led ewes with their soft bells at the front, Anders gave the long, low whistle that meant the start, and set off down, and the led ewes followed him, their bells beginning to ring soft and steady. And behind them, the whole flock flowed forward and down to the path, and the young dogs took up their places at the edges, and the long, slow walk home began. And down they went, all the long, gentle day. The path off the high pasture was an old one, worn into the mountain by hundreds of years of flocks going up in the spring and coming down in the autumn. And Anders and his sheep followed it down now, as their kind always had, out across the high, bare tops, in and amongst the great grey rocks, and then down through the high gap in the mountains, the pass, where the wind blew cold and thin, and then down and down, the whole flock pouring slow along the narrow path like water finding its way downhill. It was unhurried, the way down. A flock cannot be hurried, and should not be, and Anders never tried. He let them set their own slow pace, drifting and cropping a little as they went, and he walked behind and among them at the pace of the slowest, and the dogs ran the edges keeping the stragglers in, and the bells rang soft and steady on the led ewes at the front, all the long way down. There was no sound in all the wide morning, but the bells, and the hooves on the stone, and the wind, and now and then Anders's low whistle to a dog, the old quiet music of a flock coming down a mountain that had sounded on these slopes every autumn for 1,000 years. And as they came down, the mountain changed around them, the way it always did. Up at the top, it had been bare and grey and cold. The thin, high air and the rock and the first snow on the peaks above. But step by step, lower and lower, the world grew kinder. The first thin grass came back underfoot, and then the first low bushes, and then the first trees, and the air warmed and softened and lost its high, cold edge, and the autumn colours came on, the slopes going gold and rust red and warm in the low afternoon sun. The cold of the heights fell away behind them and above them, and it was, lower down, a mild and golden autumn day. Anders felt the warming come up to meet him in his old bones, and was glad of it, the way he was glad of it every single year. Down and down, the bells ringing soft, the dogs working easy, the whole flock walking home. Part way down, where the path crossed a stream coming off the mountain, Anders stopped to rest and water the flock. The sheep spread out to drink and to crop the grass along the bank, and the dogs flopped down panting in the cool shallows and lapped at the water. And Anders sat himself on a warm rock in the sun and ate a little bread and cheese, and rested his old legs a while, in no hurry. The valley still a good way below, but the day still young. It was there, at the rest, that he saw which one was lagging. There was always one, a lamb of the spring, usually the smallest of the year, or one gone footsore on the long stony path, that fell behind and came in last and stood at the back of the flock looking weary. This year it was a small late lamb, the littlest of them all, who had walked gamely the whole way from the top, but was tiring now on the long descent, and stood apart and would not graze, only stood with its head held a little low. Anders knew that look. He had seen it in 100 small lambs over 100 autumns. So when they set off again, he did the thing he had done for all those 100 small lambs before. He went and gathered the little one up and settled it across his shoulders, behind his neck, with a small leg held in each of his hands, the old way, the way shepherds have always carried a tired lamb. And he carried it himself, the rest of the way down. It was no weight to speak of, a lamb, and it settled at once across his warm shoulders, and left off its weary standing, and rode the last of the journey home in the safest place on the whole mountain. And Anders walked on down with the small, warm weight of it about his neck, and did not mind it in the least. It was, if anything, his favourite part of the whole day, the carrying of the tired one, the small life resting trustful on his shoulders, the surest sign there ever was that he was bringing them home. Down and down, and the valley growing greener below. And then, in the long golden afternoon, they came round the last shoulder of the mountain, and there below them, at last, was home. The whole home valley opened out beneath them, green still and sheltered and warm in the low sun. The river winding bright along the bottom of it, the village with its grey roofs and its threads of rising smoke, the patchwork of small fields, and just below them now, the home pastures and the old stone fold where the flock would winter, snug and safe under the shoulder of the lower hills. After the bare grey heights, after the long day's walking, there it all was, soft and green and waiting. And the sight of it was the gladdest sight of the shepherd's whole year. The flock saw it too, or smelled it rather, smelled the home valley and the home grass coming up to meet them, and they quickened of their own accord, the whole tired flock lifting its pace and pouring down the last green slopes toward home. The bells ringing faster and brighter now, the dogs trotting glad alongside, the little lamb lifting its head on Anders' shoulders to look. They were nearly down. They were nearly home. And high, high above them now, far up on the peaks they had left that morning, Anders could see the snow beginning to come down at last out of a greying sky onto the high pasture, the winter arriving up there, behind them and after them, and too late to catch them, for they were down and safe and well ahead of it, the way they were every year. He brought them on down the last of the slope as the afternoon turned to gold and the warm valley rose to meet them. They came down into the home valley in the last of the gold light and brought the flock in. The dogs eased them off the open hill and down the lane and in through the gate of the home pasture, the snug walled fields under the lower hills where the deep snow never came, and the sheep spread out onto the rich low grass with the small glad sounds of animals that know that they are home. Anders lifted the little lamb down from his shoulders at last and set it on its feet on the home grass, and it found its mother in a moment and was a tired lamb no longer, but only a lamb at home, and ran. And then Anders did the last thing, the thing that closed the season. He counted them. He stood at the gate in the falling evening and counted the flock through, the old slow, careful count, the way he had every autumn of his life. And they were all there, every one. The whole flock he had taken up the mountain in the spring, brought down again whole in the autumn. Not one lost to the heights or the long path. Every ewe and every grown lamb, and the littlest late one too, all of them down and in and safe and home before the snow. The count came right, the way it had come right year on year on year, and Anders shut the gate on his whole safe flock and stood a moment with his hand resting on the cold top bar of it, and was about as deeply content as a man can be. For that was the whole of it, really. The whole of a shepherd's long year, and the whole of a shepherd's long life. To take them up in the spring, and mind them all the summer, and bring every one of them safely down again before the winter. He had done it once more. The flock was home. The young dogs flopped down in the lane, spent and happy, and old Bran eased his grey bones down among them with a sigh. The first stars were coming out over the valley, and the soft bells, as the flock spread out to graze the home pasture in the dusk, fell slowly, one by one, quiet. The whole flock safely down and home in the green valley, grazing slow and content in the last of the light. The gate shut, the count come right, everyone brought down before the snow, the young dogs and the old one resting easy together in the lane, the little lamb back with its mother, high above, the winter coming down at last on the empty peaks. And down here, only the warm valley, and the quiet, and a season faithfully kept, the soft bells falling still, one by one, as the dusk comes gently down. Tonight, a warm story from a village on a winter evening, long ago, about the women who gathered round one lamplit table to finish a great quilt together for a young bride, and stitched into it, square by square, the whole warm love of the village. On the coldest evening of the winter so far, the women of the village came one by one out of the dark and the snow and in through old Maisie's warm door, shaking the cold off their shawls, because tonight was the night they would finish Annie's quilt. It had been on the frame in Maisie's big, warm kitchen for weeks. A great quilt, the biggest they had made in years, and they had all had a hand in it. An hour here and an evening there, all through the dark of the winter. But tonight they meant to finish it, all of them together. The last of the stitching done, and the whole thing closed up and folded by the end of the evening, in good time for Annie's wedding. Annie was there too, of course, in the middle of them, for it was her quilt. The quilt that would go on the bed in the little house she and the young man she was to marry had just taken at the end of the lane, the bed they would start their whole life in. She was 18 and shy, and more than a little daunted by all of it. The wedding, and the house, and the being a wife, and the whole great unknown grown-up life just ahead of her. And she sat down among the women that evening with her own needle, not at all sure, the way the young are, that she was ready for any of it. The kitchen was warm and full and golden. Old Maisie's fire was banked up high against the cold. The big lamp hung low over the quilt frame, throwing its warm light down onto the work. And round the frame the women settled into their places, the old ones and the young ones, the mothers and the grandmothers, Annie's own mother, and her aunt, and the neighbours she had known all her life, pulling their stools and chairs in close, threading their needles by the lamplight, the snow ticking soft at the dark window, and the whole cold winter shut safely outside. There was tea keeping warm by the fire, and a cake somebody had brought, and the good, easy murmur of women who have known each other all their lives, settling into a long evening's work together. And then they bent to it, all those hands at once, and began to finish Annie's quilt. They worked the way they always did, which was all together and all at once. A quilt at this stage is sewn from all sides. The great cloth stretched tight and flat on the frame. The women sitting all round the edge of it, each working her own near part of it, all of them stitching slowly inward toward the middle. And so the whole table of them bent over the one quilt, a dozen needles going at once, dipping and pulling, dipping and pulling. The small bright flash of the needles in the lamplight, and the soft sound of the thread drawn through, over and over, all round the frame. Annie stitched too, in her place between her mother and old Maisie, and tried to keep her stitches small and even and good. She was not the best sewer among them, not nearly, and she knew it. And at first she watched her own hands anxiously and pricked her finger twice, and was sure her stitches stood out clumsy and lumpy beside the neat practiced ones on either side of her. But no one said a word about it, except that Maisie, without even looking up, told her quietly that her stitches were coming along just fine, and that a quilt did not want every stitch perfect, only every stitch made with care, and that anyway the lumpy ones were the ones you could tell were made by hand, by someone who loved you and not bought in a shop. And Annie, hearing that, stitched on a little easier. The talk started up slow, the way it does, and then went round and round the frame as steady as the needles, a comfortable, unhurried, many-voiced murmur of village women at their work, the snow at the window, and the lamp warm overhead. They talked of small things, and nothing things, and everybody's things. And Annie, the youngest there by 20 years, mostly just listened and stitched, and felt the warmth of the room and the warmth of the talk settle round her. Slowly, the way the quilt itself was coming together, square by square. And as they worked, the quilt began to tell its stories. For it was a quilt made all of scraps, pieced together the old way, out of bits of worn-out and outgrown and saved-up cloth, every square of it cut from something that had once been something else. And the women, stitching, remembered as they went where each piece had come from, and told it round the frame. "That blue square there," said Annie's aunt, tapping it with her needle. "That was off your grandmother's good Sunday dress, Annie, the one she wore to church for 30 years. Do you not know it?" And Annie looked at the soft, faded blue and found that she did know it, that she could half remember leaning against that very cloth as a small child, and something turned over warm in her chest. "And that bit of white," said another, "the one with the little flowers on it. That's from the christening gown. The gown we've every one of us been christened in, you too, Annie, and your mother before you, and half the village besides. And that strong brown there, that was a piece of old Tom the carter's coat, would you believe, that his widow gave for it. And that little scrap of red." And laughter went round the frame. Well, everyone knew the story of the little red, and on it went, all round the frame. A square from a wedding dress 20 years gone. A square from a baby's first blanket. A square from an apron worn soft by a good woman's whole lifetime in a kitchen. A square, even, cut from a dress of Annie's own, from when she was 6 and would wear nothing else. And Annie, listening to it all, looking at it all spread out under the lamp, began to understand what they had made for her. It was not only a quilt, It was the whole village, pieced together, bits of everyone's lives, the christenings and the Sundays and the long marriages, and the ones now gone, all the cloth of all their years, cut up and sewn back into one warm hole and given to her to start her own life under. She would sleep all her married life under a blanket made of everyone she had ever known. She would be warm on the coldest nights under the gathered up years of the whole village. She had not known a thing could hold so much. She bent her head over her own small stitches, so the women would not see the brightness come into her eyes. Though every one of them saw it, of course, and every one of them had felt it too. Once, the first time the village wrapped them up in itself like this, and they let her be, and stitched on, and the warm talk closed gently over her, and the quilt grew, square by square, toward done. The evening wore on warm and slow, and the talk went round and round. Somebody made fresh tea, and the cake was cut and passed, and the needles never stopped. And the talk, as it always did when the women were together, and a young bride was among them, came round in its easy way to what was coming for Annie, to marriage, and to keeping a house, and to the life she was about to start down the lane. But they did not lecture her, these women. That was not their way. They only told it sideways, in stories and laughing, and the odd dropped word, the way real wisdom is always passed. The small true things about living alongside a man and raising the children and getting through the hard winters and the lean years. All of it folded into ordinary talk and laughter, so that it went into Annie gently, without her quite noticing it was going in. One told, laughing at herself, of her own first year of married muddle, and how nothing had turned out as grand or as terrible as she had feared. One said the whole secret of a long marriage was a short memory, and the old ones all laughed, because they knew that it was true. One, quietly, told Annie that she had been a fine girl and would make a finer woman, and not to be frightened of any of it. And Annie, warm with the tea and the lamplight and all their voices, found the great daunting unknown life ahead of her growing smaller and kinder as the evening went on. For here, all round her, were women who had each walked into that same unknown once. Frightened too, once, every one of them, and had come through it, and were sitting here now, warm and laughing and whole, to tell her, without quite saying it, that she would come through it as well. She was not, she began to see, walking into her life alone. None of them ever had. You walked into it with the whole long line of women who had gone before you at your back, and it seemed with a quilt made by all their hands to keep you warm along the way. She stitched and listened and was less afraid. And then, near the end of the evening, there was only the last of it to do. The great quilt was nearly finished, the squares all joined, the soft warm inside all sewn through, only the last stretch of the edge left to close, and the women worked it down all together, their dozen needles drawing in toward the last of it, until there was just a hand's width left open, and then only a few stitches. And then it was all but done. Old Maisie, whose frame it was, and who had led the making of more village quilts than anyone living, gave the last stitch to Annie. She would not have it any other way. She threaded the needle and put it into the girl's hand and showed her the place. And Annie, with all the women watching, and the lamp warm overhead, and her heart very full, made the last few stitches of it herself. Small and careful, and made with love, lumpy ones and all, and drew the thread through, and snipped it, and the quilt was finished. Hers, theirs, done. For a moment nobody said anything. They only looked at it. The whole great warm thing of it spread out finished under the lamp. All those hundreds of squares, all those years and lives and hands, sewn at last into one. It was, they all agreed, getting up to stretch their stiff backs and fingers, one of the best they had ever made, and it had been made, every last stitch of it, for the shy girl standing in the middle of them with the bright eyes, about to start her life. And then they wrapped her up in it. It was Maisie who began it, lifting the finished quilt up off the frame, all warm and new and heavy with the making, and instead of folding it away, she came round behind Annie and laid it over the girl's shoulders and drew it close around her, the whole great warm weight of it. And the other women laughed and helped, tucking it round her, until Annie stood there in the middle of the warm kitchen, wrapped head to foot in the quilt they had all just made, wrapped in her grandmother's Sunday dress, and the village christening gown, and old Tom the carter's coat, and her own first little dress, and the wedding dresses, and the aprons and all the gathered cloth of all their years. The whole village's lives wound warm around her at once. And it was warm. That was the plain and lovely truth of it. It was a very warm quilt, and standing wrapped in it by the fire, she was warm right through. But she was warm the other way too. The way there is no good plain word for. Warm with being so wholly and so simply loved by all these women, by the whole village at her back, all of it made solid and put into her arms, in a thing she could wrap around herself and carry home down the lane and sleep under every night of her life. She pulled it closer round her and looked round at all their faces in the lamplight and could not say a single thing, and did not need to. They had a last cup of tea, the quilt still round Annie's shoulders, none of them in any hurry now to go out into the cold. The snow had stopped at the window. The fire burned low and good, and the great quilt, finished at last by all those hands in one warm evening, was folded soft and given to the girl to carry home, the love of the whole village, made warm and made real and made hers. The great quilt finished and folded soft, warm still from all the hands that made it. The women sitting back with a last cup of tea by the low fire, in no hurry to go out into the cold. The snow stopped at the dark window, the lamp gold and low, and the young bride with the whole warm love of the village folded into her arms to carry home down the lane and to sleep under. Every night of the life she was no longer afraid to start.